7-year-old Grace Whitman pressed her trembling hand against her baby brother's chest, counting each shallow breath as the abandoned cabin creaked around them in the howling wind. The temperature had dropped to 15 below, and Caleb's lips were turning blue. She wasn't supposed to be the one keeping him alive. Outside, something moved through the trees, a shadow with yellow eyes that had been circling their shelter for the past hour. Grace pulled the torn blanket tighter around Caleb's shivering body, her own breath forming desperate clouds in the freezing air. Their mother had been gone for 6 hours now, her blood still staining the snow where she'd crawled away from the wrecked car. Grace had watched through the broken window as Mama disappeared into the storm, whispering promises she might not live to keep. Caleb's inhaler lay empty beside them. 4 doses left this morning. None now. "Please don't let him find us," Grace whispered into the darkness, unsure if she meant the man who'd been hunting them or the creature stalking outside. In 2 hours, when Caleb's lungs seized again, she'd have to choose between hiding and saving her brother's life. What she didn't know was that the yellow eyes belonged to their salvation. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 48 hours earlier, Rebecca Whitman had been stacking coffee-stained plates at Mel's all-night diner, her 3rd job that week. Her fingers ached from the double shifts, but the tips from the truckers heading south might cover Caleb's inhaler refills. At 29, she looked older, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix, carved into the lines around her eyes by 3 years of running. Grace sat in the corner booth, homework spread across the cracked vinyl, helping 2-year-old Caleb color inside the lines of a dinosaur picture. She'd learned to be quiet during Mama's work hours, learned to make Caleb laugh when his breathing got wheezy, learned to count money and stretch every dollar like her father had taught her before Afghanistan took him away. The bell above the diner door chimed at 11:47 p.m. Rebecca's hands froze on the coffee pot when she saw the tall man in the expensive coat, Jackson Thornfield, still hunting them after 3 months of hiding in different towns across West Virginia. His smile never reached his cold blue eyes, the same smile he'd worn when he'd first appeared at the children's shelter, claiming to help single mothers make better choices. "Hello, Rebecca. You've led me quite a chase." Jackson slid into the booth across from Grace, who instinctively pulled Caleb closer. "These children deserve stability, proper families who can provide for them." Rebecca's voice caught in her throat. "They have a family. They have me." "A family?" Jackson's laugh was soft, poisonous. "You work 80 hours a week for minimum wage. Grace hasn't been to school in 2 months. When was the last time Caleb saw a real doctor?" He placed a manila folder on the table. "I have legal guardianship papers for Caleb. His birth mother signed them before she died. My late wife helped arrange the adoption." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. But Rebecca saw the truth in his briefcase. Photographed files of 31 other children, neat rows of faces he'd relocated to wealthy families who paid handsomely for discretion. Grace wasn't in those photos yet, but Rebecca knew she would be soon. At 2:15 a.m., Rebecca bundled the children into a borrowed Honda with $43 and a tank of gas. Jackson's black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror 20 miles outside town, its headlights cutting through the mountain fog like searchlights hunting prey. She never saw the ice patch that sent them spinning into the ravine. The Honda's headlights carved through the mountain darkness as Rebecca pressed harder on the accelerator, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. In the back seat, Grace held Caleb against her chest, singing the lullaby their father used to hum, "You Are My Sunshine," her 7-year-old voice steady despite the terror coursing through the car. "Mama, he's still behind us," Grace whispered, watching Jackson's SUV gain ground in the side mirror. Rebecca's eyes darted to the fuel gauge. A quarter tank left, maybe 50 miles if they were lucky. The mountain roads twisted like a serpent's spine, each curve bringing them deeper into the Monongahela wilderness, where cell towers couldn't reach and help was a foreign concept. She'd chosen this route hoping to lose Jackson in the maze of logging trails, but now she realized her mistake. Out here, there would be no witnesses. The first patch of black ice appeared without warning at mile marker 47. Rebecca felt the wheels lose their grip, the Honda sliding sideways toward the guardrail that separated them from a 100-foot drop into Cheat River Canyon. She fought the skid, overcorrected, and watched in slow motion as Jackson's headlights swung wide to avoid them. "Hold on, babies," she whispered. The second patch of ice sealed their fate. The Honda spun twice before slamming into the rocky embankment, the passenger side crumpling like paper against an ancient oak tree. Steam hissed from the punctured radiator, and the acrid smell of leaking antifreeze filled the air. Grace's ears rang from the impact, but she could still hear Caleb crying. A good sign, their daddy had always said. Crying meant breathing. Rebecca hung motionless against her seatbelt, blood trickling from a gash above her left eyebrow. "Grace," she whispered, her voice thick and strange. "Grace, honey, can you move?" "Yes, Mama." Grace unbuckled herself and checked Caleb's car seat. Secure, unbroken, their miracle intact. "We're okay back here." But Rebecca wasn't okay. She could feel warmth spreading across her ribs, and when she tried to move her left arm, lightning shot through her shoulder. Something was wrong inside, something important and unfixable with Band-Aids and kisses. Jackson's SUV pulled up 20 yards away, its engine idling like a predator catching its breath. Through the cracked windshield, Rebecca watched him step into the headlight beams, his expensive shoes crunching over broken glass and twisted metal. He moved with the patience of someone who knew the hunt was over. "Rebecca!" he called out, his voice carrying false concern. "Let me help you. The children need medical attention." Grace clutched Caleb tighter, remembering the stories Mama had told her about the bad man who stole children and gave them to strangers. "Mama, don't let him take us." Rebecca's vision blurred, but her mind cleared with the terrible clarity that comes before darkness. She unbuckled her seatbelt and turned toward the back seat, her movements slow and deliberate despite the fire in her chest. "Grace, listen to me very carefully. Do you remember the camping games Daddy taught you? Hide and seek in the woods?" Grace nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's right, baby girl. You take Caleb and you play hide and seek. Find somewhere warm and safe and don't come out until you see good people, police officers or park rangers with badges. Can you do that for Mama? I don't want to leave you." Rebecca reached back and touched Grace's face, memorizing the feel of her daughter's skin. "Sometimes the bravest thing is running away to fight another day. Your daddy told me that before he went to war. Now you're my brave soldier, and Caleb is your mission." Jackson's footsteps grew closer, each crunch of gravel counting down their final seconds together. "There's an old cabin about half a mile up that trail," Rebecca whispered, pointing through the shattered rear window toward a barely visible footpath. "Find it. Hide there. I'm going to draw him away from you." Grace understood, the way children understand when the world shifts, and suddenly they must become older than their years. She kissed her mother's forehead, tasting salt and copper. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too, little sunshine. Both of you, more than all the stars." Grace climbed through the back window with Caleb in her arms, his medical bag clutched in her free hand. The November wind cut through their thin jackets, but she followed the trail into the darkness, leaving behind the only mother she'd ever known. Behind them, Rebecca Whitman opened her car door and stumbled into Jackson Thornfield's waiting arms, her sacrifice buying her children the precious minutes they needed to disappear into the forest. She never saw them reach the abandoned cabin, never heard Grace's whispered promise. I'll keep him safe, Mama. I promise. 6 hours had passed since Grace carried Caleb into the abandoned hunting cabin, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. She'd found matches in a rusted coffee can and managed to light a small fire in the stone hearth, just like Daddy had taught her during their camping trips to Seneca Rocks. But the broken windows let in more cold than the fire could push out, and Caleb's breathing had grown shallow and labored. Grace pressed her ear to her baby brother's chest, counting the wheezes between each breath. 18 months old, and he'd already survived more than most children ever would, but his lungs were failing without his medication. She'd given him the last puff from his inhaler 2 hours ago, and now the empty plastic chamber mocked her from beside the dying embers. "It's okay, Caleb," she whispered, though her own teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Mama's gonna come back. She's gonna bring help." But even as she spoke the words, Grace knew something was terribly wrong. Mama had promised to return before dark, and now the moon hung high and cold above the forest canopy. No car engines, no flashlight beams cutting through the trees, no rescue that would make this nightmare end. The yellow eyes appeared first as pinpricks of light beyond the shattered window frame. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled Caleb closer, remembering every scary story about wolves and bears that roamed these mountains. But as the creature stepped into the moonlight, she saw something unexpected in those amber eyes. Not hunger, but concern. The she-wolf was magnificent and terrifying, her gray coat thick with winter fur, her ears pricked forward in a posture Grace somehow recognized as protective rather than predatory. Luna had been watching the cabin for hours, drawn by the scent of children in distress and memories of her own lost pups. "Easy, girl," Grace whispered, the way Daddy had taught her to speak to frightened animals. "We're not going to hurt you." Luna padded closer, her massive paws silent on the cabin floor. She sniffed the air around Caleb, her sensitive nose detecting the chemical changes that preceded respiratory failure. The wolf had seen death before, too much of it, and something primal in her brain recognized the urgency of the moment. Behind Luna, heavy footsteps crunched through the underbrush. Grace's breath caught in her throat, certain that Jackson had finally found them. But the figure that appeared in the doorway was older, broader, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades reading the mountain's moods. Abraham Stoneheart stopped dead when he saw the children, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At 65, he'd thought his days of rescue were behind him, but Luna's distressed howling had pulled him from his evening routine of whiskey and regret. The she-wolf never acted without reason, and now he understood why she'd been pacing his cabin all evening. "Jesus Christ," Abe breathed, taking in the scene, a little girl barely older than his Sarah had been, clutching a baby who was obviously in medical distress. "How long have you been out here, sweetheart?" 6 hours. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Mama went to get help after our car crashed, but she didn't come back. Caleb needs his medicine, but it's all gone." Abe's trained eye assessed the situation in seconds. The baby's lips were turning blue, his breathing rapid and shallow, classic signs of severe asthma exacerbation. Without intervention, the child would be dead within the hour. He'd seen enough emergencies during his 30 years as a sheriff to recognize when seconds mattered more than protocol. "Luna, back," he commanded softly, and the she-wolf immediately retreated to give him room. Abe knelt beside Grace, his large hands gentle as he examined Caleb. "What's his name, honey?" "Caleb. He's my little brother." Grace's eyes were huge with fear and hope. "Are you a good man? Animals know about good men. That's what Mama says." Despite everything, Abe almost smiled. "Well, Luna seems to think so, and she's got better judgment than most people I know." He scooped Caleb into his arms, feeling how light the child was, how fragile. "My name's Abe, and I'm going to help you both. But first, we need to get this little guy breathing better." From his jacket pocket, Abe pulled an emergency inhaler, the kind he'd carried since Sarah's diagnosis, the one he could never bring himself to throw away after she died. His hand shook as he administered 2 careful puffs to Caleb's airways, and within seconds, the baby's color began to improve. "Is he going to be okay?" Grace asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's going to be fine," Abe promised, though his mind was already racing ahead to the larger problem. 2 children alone in the mountains, mother missing, car crashed somewhere in the wilderness. This wasn't an accident or a family hiking trip gone wrong. This was something much darker. Luna pressed against Grace's side, offering warmth and comfort with an intelligence that still amazed Abe after 3 years of partnership. The wolf had an uncanny ability to sense human emotion, to provide exactly what was needed in moments of crisis. "Grace, I need you to tell me about your mama. What was she running from?" The little girl's face crumpled, and in that moment she looked exactly like Sarah had during those final weeks. Too young to carry such enormous burdens, yet forced to be braver than any child should ever have to be. "The bad man," Grace whispered. "He wants to take us away from Mama. He says we need better parents, but Mama's the best mama in the whole world." Abe's blood turned to ice. After 3 years of forced retirement, 3 years of drowning his guilt in isolation and alcohol, the same nightmare that had taken his family was playing out again right in front of him. This time he wouldn't fail. The journey through the forest to Abe's cabin took 45 minutes of careful navigation through snow-covered trails that hadn't seen human footsteps in months. Grace walked beside him, her small hand gripping Luna's thick fur for warmth and balance, while Abe carried Caleb wrapped in his heavy winter coat. The she-wolf led them through shortcuts only she knew, her keen senses alert for any signs of pursuit. Abe's cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, its log walls weathered but solid, windows glowing with the promise of warmth. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and Grace felt something ease in her chest for the first time in hours. This looked like the kind of place where good things happened, where families gathered around dinner tables and children fell asleep safely in their own beds. "Welcome to my home," Abe said quietly, pushing open the heavy wooden door. "It's not much, but it's warm and safe." The interior surprised Grace with its cozy comfort. Native American blankets draped over handmade furniture, family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and the scent of pine and old leather filled the air. But what caught her attention most was the small dining table set for 3 places, as if Abe had been expecting them. "I always set the table for my family," Abe explained, noticing her stare. "Old habits die hard, and hope dies even harder." He settled Caleb on the couch near the fireplace, building up the flames until the room filled with dancing shadows and blessed warmth. Luna positioned herself beside the children like a 4-legged sentinel, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight as she kept watch. Grace finally felt safe enough to speak about what had happened, her words tumbling out in fragments between sips of hot chocolate that Abe prepared with the practiced care of a grandfather. She told him about Jackson appearing at the diner, about the manila folder full of photographs, about Mama's desperate flight into the mountains. "This bad man," Abe said carefully, his weathered hands wrapped around his own mug. "Did your mama ever say his name?" "Jackson something. Jackson Thornfield, I think. He said he helped children find better families, but Mama said he was lying. She said he stole children and sold them like puppies." The mug slipped from Abe's fingers, shattering against the stone hearth. Grace jumped at the sudden crash, but Luna remained perfectly still, sensing the seismic shift in her human companion's emotional state. "That son of a—" Abe caught himself, glancing at Grace's wide eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. That name just brought back some bad memories." But they weren't just memories. They were open wounds that had never properly healed, scabs ripped away to reveal the raw grief beneath. Jackson Thornfield wasn't some phantom from Grace's imagination. He was the monster who had destroyed Abe's world 3 years ago. Sarah Stoneheart had been 5 years old when she vanished from her kindergarten playground in Morgantown. His daughter Emma had been picking her up early for a dental appointment when Jackson approached them in the parking lot, claiming to be a social worker investigating reports of child endangerment. He'd been so convincing, so professional, with his clipboard and official badges and concerned expressions. The investigation had consumed Abe's life for 18 months. He'd followed every lead, interviewed every witness, connected dots that others claimed didn't exist. But Jackson was careful, protected by money and connections that reached into the highest levels of state government. When Abe got too close to the truth, he'd been forced into early retirement on grounds of psychological instability and obsessive behavior. Emma never got over losing Sarah. She'd blamed herself for not running, for not screaming, for trusting the nice man with the clipboard. The guilt ate her alive from the inside out, and on a rainy Tuesday in March, she drove her car into the Monongahela River, rather than face another day without her daughter. Abe had lost everything: his granddaughter to a predator, his daughter to despair, and his purpose to a system that valued political convenience over justice. He'd retreated to this cabin to drink himself to death in private. But Luna had found him first, a wounded wolf pup who needed saving as much as he did. "Mr. Abe?" Grace's small voice pulled him back from the abyss of memory. "You look sad. Did the bad man hurt your family too?" The simplicity of her question cut deeper than any interrogation he'd ever endured. Here was this brave little girl, having lost everything herself, still concerned about his pain. It reminded him why he'd become a cop in the first place, not for the badge or the authority, but to protect innocents like Grace from monsters like Jackson. "Yes, sweetheart, he did hurt my family. But that's why I'm going to make sure he never hurts yours." Abe walked to his bedroom closet and pulled down a locked metal case that hadn't been opened in 3 years. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic evidence bags, were copies of everything he'd collected during his investigation: photographs, financial records, witness statements, phone logs, all the pieces of a puzzle that official channels had refused to assemble. Grace watched him spread the documents across the dining table, her young mind trying to process what she was seeing. There were pictures of other children, dozens of them, with notes about placement fees and family matching services. She recognized some of the faces from missing child posters she'd seen in gas station bathrooms during their months of running. "He really does steal children," she whispered. "He's been doing it for years," Abe confirmed grimly. "Taking kids from families he claims are unfit and selling them to wealthy couples who can't adopt through legal channels. He's got judges on his payroll, social workers who falsify reports, even police officers who look the other way." Luna padded over to the table, her sensitive nose picking up familiar scents from the evidence bags. She'd been with Abe during many late-night investigation sessions, watching him piece together Jackson's network of corruption and cruelty. The wolf understood more than most people realized. She knew these papers represented justice denied and families destroyed. As if responding to some internal clock, Caleb began to wheeze again, his small body fighting for air. Abe quickly administered another dose from the emergency inhaler, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. The baby needed proper medical care, and soon. "Grace, I need to ask you something important," Abe said, kneeling beside her chair. "Do you remember exactly where your mama's car went off the road? Any landmarks or mile markers?" Grace closed her eyes, picturing the terrifying moments before the crash. There was a sign about Cheat River, and one of those yellow signs with the squiggly arrow that means the road turns. "Route 33 near the canyon overlook," Abe murmured, his mind already calculating distances and search patterns. "That's rough country, but if she survived the initial impact..." He reached for his satellite phone, one of the few luxuries he'd maintained in his exile, and dialed the emergency services dispatcher in Elkins. The conversation was brief and professional, requesting a search and rescue operation for a possible vehicle accident near mile marker 47. But even as he provided the location details, Abe knew that Jackson would be monitoring emergency channels, waiting for any sign that his quarry had surfaced. Every call for help was also a beacon drawing the hunter closer to his prey. The satellite phone's caller ID lit up 20 minutes later with a number Abe recognized. Sheriff Dale Morrison, his former partner and one of the few honest cops left in the county. "Abe, Jesus, where have you been? We've got a situation down here that's got your name written all over it." "I'm listening." "Found a woman about 2 hours ago, unconscious beside a wrecked Honda on Route 33. Severe head trauma, possible internal injuries. But here's the strange part. She keeps asking for you, keeps saying, 'Find Abraham Stoneheart, he'll know what to do.'" Abe's throat constricted. Rebecca Whitman was alive, fighting for her life in some hospital bed, trusting him to protect the children she'd died trying to save. "Dale, listen to me very carefully. That woman's name is Rebecca Whitman, and she's got 2 small children who are in immediate danger from Jackson Thornfield." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Abe wondered if the connection had been lost. "Jackson Thornfield?" Dale's voice was carefully neutral. "Abe, you know I can't reopen that case. The district attorney made it very clear. This isn't about reopening old cases. This is about 2 kids who are going to disappear forever if we don't act tonight. Grace is 7 years old, Dale. Same age Sarah was when—" "Don't." Dale's voice cracked with old pain. "Don't do that to me, Abe. You know I tried everything I could back then." "I know you did. But now we have a second chance to get it right." Through the cabin window, Luna's head snapped up, her ears pricked forward in the alert posture that meant danger approaching. She padded to the door and released a low growl that made the hair on Abe's neck stand on end. Grace felt it too, that electric tension that preceded storms and predators. "Mr. Abe, Luna's scared." Abe peered through the curtains into the moonlit clearing, his heart sinking as he spotted the distant glow of headlights winding through the forest access road. Jackson had found them, which meant someone in the sheriff's department had leaked their location within minutes of the rescue call. "Dale, I need you to do something for me," Abe said quietly into the phone. "Check the GPS tracking on all your patrol units. Someone's been feeding information to Jackson, and these children are about to pay the price." The headlights grew brighter, closer, accompanied by the deep rumble of heavy engines. Not one vehicle, but several. Jackson never traveled alone anymore, not after too many close calls with angry parents and suspicious investigators. Abe disconnected the call and turned to face Grace, who was holding Caleb against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. Luna positioned herself between the children and the door, every muscle coiled for battle. "Sweetheart, remember those camping games your daddy taught you? We're going to play hide and seek again, but this time, Luna's going to help." The first vehicle's engine cut through the mountain silence like a chainsaw, followed by the slam of heavy doors and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Abe counted at least 3 distinct voices in the darkness outside, Jackson's smooth tenor rising above the others as he coordinated his team's approach to the cabin. "Remember, we need the children unharmed," Jackson's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air. "The buyers are very specific about their requirements, and damaged merchandise reflects poorly on our operation." Abe's blood turned to ice at the casual way Jackson referred to Grace and Caleb as merchandise. He'd spent 3 years imagining this confrontation, but now that the moment had arrived, all his carefully planned scenarios crumbled before the reality of 2 terrified children who trusted him to keep them safe. Luna's growl deepened to a rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The she-wolf had positioned herself at the center of the cabin, equidistant from the front door, back window, and the children huddled near the fireplace. Her amber eyes reflected the flames like molten gold, and every line of her powerful body telegraphed deadly intent. "Grace," Abe whispered urgently, "take Caleb to the root cellar behind the kitchen. There's a hidden door under the braided rug. Lift the iron ring and climb down. Don't come out until you hear my voice calling your name 3 times. What about you and Luna?" Grace's eyes were huge with fear, but her voice remained steady. At 7 years old, she'd already learned that survival sometimes meant asking the right questions instead of arguing with adult decisions. "We're going to have a conversation with the bad man. Sometimes grown-ups need to settle things the old-fashioned way." Abe checked his revolver, a .357 Smith Wesson that hadn't been fired in anger for over a decade. His hands trembled slightly as he spun the cylinder, counting 6 bullets against an unknown number of enemies. Through the window, flashlight beams swept across the clearing like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners. Jackson's team was conducting a professional tactical approach, checking sight lines and potential escape routes with military precision. Abe recognized the pattern from his law enforcement training. These weren't amateur thugs, but experienced operators who understood how to contain and control a target area. "Abraham Stoneheart," Jackson's voice boomed across the clearing with false joviality. "I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me. Let's discuss this situation like civilized men, shall we?" Abe positioned himself beside the front window, keeping low to avoid presenting a silhouette against the firelight. Luna padded silently to the back of the cabin, her keen hearing tracking footsteps that circled toward the rear entrance. The she-wolf had learned hard lessons about human predators during her years in the wild, and she understood that danger rarely announced itself through the front door. "Those children don't belong to you, Thornfield," Abe called out, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. "They belong with their mother, who's fighting for her life in a hospital bed because of your greed." Jackson's laughter echoed off the surrounding pines, cold and sharp as breaking glass. Their mother, that pathetic waitress who couldn't provide basic medical care for her asthmatic son, who lived in her car for 3 months rather than accept my help in finding these children proper homes. The front door exploded inward under the impact of a tactical battering ram, splinters of ancient oak flying across the cabin floor. 2 figures in black tactical gear rushed through the opening, their faces hidden behind night vision goggles and assault masks. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd forgotten about Luna. The she-wolf launched herself from the shadows like a gray missile, her 90 pounds of muscle and bone slamming into the first intruder's chest with enough force to crack ribs. The man's scream cut through the night air as Luna's teeth found the soft flesh of his throat, not deep enough to kill, but certainly deep enough to remove him from the fight. Abe used the distraction to his advantage, stepping out from behind the overturned kitchen table and putting 2 round center mass into the second intruder. The .357's thunderous reports shook dust from the cabin rafters, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air like incense in a violent church. "Jesus Christ, she's got a wolf!" The wounded man's voice cracked with panic as Luna maintained her grip on his throat, her amber eyes boring into his with predatory intelligence. Blood seeped through his tactical vest where her claws had found purchase, but she held back from delivering the killing bite that her instincts demanded. Jackson appeared in the doorway, his expensive overcoat incongruous against the backdrop of violence and chaos. At 38, he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. But Abe could see uncertainty flickering behind his cold blue eyes. "Call off your pet, Stoneheart. We both know how this ends. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender the children now, and I'll make sure you die quickly instead of slowly." "Or," Abe replied conversationally, his revolver trained on Jackson's chest, "you could explain to me why a man who claims to help children has 3 armed men breaking into my home in the middle of the night." Jackson stepped carefully over the threshold, his hands visible but close to the concealed weapon Abe knew he carried. Behind him, at least two more figures remained hidden in the darkness, their positions betrayed by the occasional glint of moonlight off metal. "Those children represent a significant investment in time and resources," Jackson said with the tone of a businessman discussing quarterly profits. "Grace, in particular, has generated considerable interest from several European families who specialize in exotic acquisitions." The clinical way Jackson discussed selling a 7-year-old girl into slavery made Abe's trigger finger twitch with homicidal intent. But he forced himself to remain calm, to gather intelligence that might help convict Jackson when this nightmare finally ended. "Exotic acquisitions," Abe repeated slowly. "You mean pedophiles who pay premium prices for American children? I prefer to think of them as collectors who appreciate rare beauty." Jackson's smile was the kind predators wore when cornering wounded prey. "Grace has that special quality they seek. Innocence combined with resilience, beauty tempered by suffering. She'll bring at least $200,000 at auction, possibly more if she's properly trained." Luna's growl deepened at the sound of Jackson's voice, and her grip on the wounded man's throat tightened fractionally. The intruder whimpered like a kicked dog, his night vision goggles askew and his tactical confidence shattered by 90 pounds of apex predator. From beneath the kitchen floor came a sound that made Abe's heart skip, Caleb's distinctive wheeze, the kind that preceded a full asthma attack. Grace had managed to get him to the root cellar, but the stress and cold air were triggering his respiratory distress. In minutes, the baby would need medical intervention that Grace couldn't provide. Jackson heard it too, his predator's smile widening as he recognized the sound of leverage. "That's the beautiful thing about children with medical conditions, Stoneheart. They create such wonderful opportunities for negotiation. How long can little Caleb survive without his medication? 30 minutes? An hour? Long enough for me to put 6 bullets in your black heart," Abe snarled. But they both knew he was bluffing. Every minute spent in standoff was a minute closer to Caleb's death, and Jackson understood the mathematics of desperation better than anyone. "Here's what's going to happen," Jackson continued with infuriating calm. "You're going to call those children up from wherever you've hidden them. My associates are going to provide immediate medical care for the baby. We have a pediatric respiratory therapist standing by in our vehicle. Then we're all going to take a nice drive to the airport, where a private jet is waiting to transport Grace and Caleb to their new families." "And if I refuse?" Jackson's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a glimpse of the monster that lurked beneath his civilized facade. "Then you get to listen to a baby suffocate while his sister begs you to save him. Is your pride worth more than their lives, Sheriff?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Abe had faced similar choices before, moments when the right decision required sacrificing everything he believed in for the sake of protecting innocence. But this felt different, more personal, weighted with the ghosts of Sarah and Emma and all the children he'd failed to save. Luna sensed his internal struggle and released her grip on the wounded intruder, who scrambled backward toward the door while clutching his torn throat. The she-wolf padded over to stand beside Abe, her amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and understanding. From the root cellar came Grace's voice, thin with terror but still trying to be brave. "It's okay, Caleb. Just breathe slow like Mama taught you. Mr. Abe's gonna help us." The faith in her voice, the absolute trust that he would somehow find a way to save them, nearly broke Abe's resolve. How could he explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes the good guys lost? That sometimes monsters won because they were willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to get what they wanted? "You have 60 seconds to decide," Jackson announced, checking an expensive watch that gleamed gold in the firelight. "After that, we stop being civilized about this situation. The standoff stretched into its third minute when Caleb's wheezing from the root cellar escalated into the wet, rattling sound that every parent with an asthmatic child learns to fear. Grace's voice drifted up through the floorboards, high and desperate. "Mr. Abe, something's wrong with Caleb. He can't breathe right." Jackson's smile widened with predatory satisfaction. "Clock's ticking, Stoneheart. That child has maybe 5 minutes before his airways close completely. My medical team can have him stabilized in 60 seconds, but only if you make the smart choice." Abe's hand tightened on his revolver, knuckles white against the wooden grip his father had carved 40 years ago. Luna pressed against his leg, her body tense as a coiled spring, waiting for the command that would unleash 3 years of pent-up rage against the man who had destroyed so many families. "Grace!" Abe called down to the root cellar. "Bring Caleb up here, sweetheart." "We're going to get him some help." "Don't do it, Mr. Abe." Grace's voice cracked with adult understanding, trapped in a child's throat. "Mama said never trust the bad man, even if he promises to help. She said that's how he tricks people." The wisdom of a 7-year-old cut through Abe's desperation like a blade through flesh. Rebecca Whitman had died trying to protect her children from Jackson's false promises, and here he was, about to hand them over because he couldn't find another way to save Caleb's life. But sometimes there was no good choice. Only degrees of evil. "I know, honey," Abe replied, his voice thick with defeat. "But sometimes we have to trust the bad man to save someone we love." Jackson gestured to someone outside the cabin, and within seconds a woman in medical scrubs entered carrying a pediatric emergency kit. "Doctor." Sarah Chen had once been a respected pediatric pulmonologist at Johns Hopkins before gambling debts and a malpractice lawsuit drove her into Jackson's employment. Her hands no longer trembled when she treated children who would disappear forever after her care. Guilt was a luxury she could no longer afford. "The baby needs immediate treatment," Dr. Chen announced with clinical detachment. "Bring him up now, or I won't be responsible for the consequences." Grace emerged from the root cellar carrying Caleb, whose lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. The 18-month-old's breathing came in shallow gasps, his small chest working frantically to draw air into constricted airways. Every parent's nightmare played out in real time as Grace stumbled under her brother's weight, her own face pale with exhaustion and terror. Dr. Chen immediately went to work with practiced efficiency, administering a nebulizer treatment and injecting steroids to reduce the inflammation in Caleb's lungs. Within minutes, the baby's color improved and his breathing eased into something approaching normal rhythm. "There," Jackson said with false benevolence. "You see how much better things go when we cooperate? The children will receive the finest medical care money can buy. Education at the best private schools in Europe, opportunities your limited resources could never provide." Abe watched Grace clutch her recovering brother, her young face cycling through relief, gratitude, and the terrible realization that accepting help from monsters came with prices that couldn't be calculated in money. "What happens to Rebecca?" Abe asked quietly. "The waitress?" Jackson shrugged with casual indifference. "Head trauma victims have such unpredictable outcomes. Sometimes they wake up, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they wake up with convenient gaps in their memory that make prosecution difficult." The casual way Jackson discussed murdering Rebecca Whitman snapped something fundamental in Abe's psychological architecture. For 3 years, he'd retreated into isolation and self-pity, nursing his failures like infected wounds. But watching Jackson's predatory smile as he discussed eliminating the mother of these children crystallized 30 years of law enforcement instincts into diamond-hard resolve. Luna felt the change in her human companion, the shift from defensive desperation to offensive fury. the she-wolf's amber eyes fixed on Jackson with renewed intensity, reading the micro-expressions and body language that signaled the end of negotiation and the beginning of violence. "You know what, Jackson?" Abe said conversationally, his revolver steady as bedrock. "I've been thinking about something you said earlier about civilized men having civilized discussions." "Yes?" "The thing is, you're not a civilized man. You're a rabid animal that needs to be put down before you hurt anyone else." Jackson's facade cracked for the first time, revealing glimpses of the rage that lurked beneath his polished exterior. "You're making a mistake, Stoneheart. I have powerful friends who—" "Had powerful friends," Abe corrected. "Past tense, because 15 minutes ago FBI agents raided the offices of Judge Morrison, District Attorney Caldwell, and 3 state senators whose campaigns you've been funding. Amazing what happens when someone finally connects all those financial records you thought you'd hidden so well." Jackson's face went ashen as the implications sank in. For 5 years his operation had thrived because corruption ran so deep in the state government that investigating him would have exposed dozens of powerful men. But if the FBI was involved, it meant someone had finally assembled enough evidence to bring down the entire network. "Sheriff Dale Morrison sends his regards," Abe continued. "Turns out he's been building a case against you for 3 years. Ever since you killed Sarah and Emma, he just needed someone with federal connections to help him get around all your bought judges and corrupt prosecutors." The truth was slightly more complicated. Dale had indeed been investigating Jackson, but the FBI raid was Abe's desperate bluff, a psychological gambit designed to shatter Jackson's confidence and create an opening for counterattack. Sometimes the best weapon against a narcissist was the fear that their carefully constructed world was crumbling. Jackson's composure finally shattered completely, his civilized mask dropping to reveal the snarling predator beneath. "You think you've won? You think destroying my network will bring back your pathetic family? Sarah screamed for her grandfather when my buyers took her to Dubai. Emma begged for death when she realized Daddy wasn't coming to save her." The words hit Abe like physical blows, each syllable designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. But instead of breaking him, Jackson's cruelty forged his resolve into something harder than steel. Luna sensed the change and began to move, her powerful muscles bunching for the attack that would end Jackson's reign of terror. Grace, still holding Caleb, looked up at Abe with eyes that held too much understanding for a 7-year-old. "Mr. Abe, is the bad man lying about your little girl?" "No, sweetheart," Abe replied softly. "He's telling the truth about what he did to my family. But he's wrong about one thing. I did learn how to save you and Caleb." Jackson reached for the pistol concealed beneath his overcoat, but Luna was already in motion, her 90 pounds of predatory muscle launching across the cabin in a gray blur of fangs and fury. The she-wolf's jaws closed around Jackson's wrist with bone-crushing force, and his weapon clattered across the floor as his screams echoed off the log walls. Dr. Chen tried to run for the door, but Abe's voice stopped her cold. "Doctor, I strongly advise you to stay exactly where you are. Luna hasn't eaten today, and she gets cranky when people try to hurt children." The remaining members of Jackson's team outside the cabin faced a terrible choice: storm the building and risk killing their employer in the crossfire, or retreat and abandon the mission that had cost them everything. Professional mercenaries understood cost-benefit analysis, and the sound of Jackson's agonized screaming suggested that the cost side of the equation was escalating rapidly. Grace pressed Caleb's face against her shoulder to shield him from the violence, but her own eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding before her. At 7 years old, she understood that sometimes monsters had to be stopped by other monsters, and sometimes the only justice was the kind that came with teeth and claws. "Please," Jackson gasped through gritted teeth as Luna maintained her grip. "Call her off. We can make a deal." Abe walked over and retrieved Jackson's pistol, checking the chamber before tucking it into his belt. "You're right. We can make a deal. You're going to tell me the location of every child you've sold, every buyer in your network, every corrupt official who helped you, and in exchange, I'll consider letting you live long enough to stand trial." Jackson's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You think this ends with me? I'm just one piece of a machine that spans continents. Kill me, and 3 more will take my place tomorrow." "Maybe," Abe acknowledged, "but they'll know what happened to you, and maybe that'll make them think twice before coming after families like ours." Outside, the distant sound of helicopter rotors began to build, growing louder as multiple aircraft approached the cabin. Jackson's face lit up with desperate hope, but Abe's smile told him everything he needed to know about who was coming to dinner. "Sounds like Dale kept his word after all," Abe said. "Federal agents can be so punctual when children's lives are at stake." The helicopters that descended into the clearing weren't Jackson's extraction team. They bore the distinctive markings of the FBI's hostage rescue team, their rotors whipping the snow into blinding whirlwinds as tactical agents rappelled down ropes like avenging angels. Jackson's face crumpled as his last hope of escape dissolved into the mountain air, replaced by the certain knowledge that his empire of exploitation had finally collapsed. Luna maintained her grip on Jackson's wrist even as federal agents swarmed the cabin, her amber eyes tracking each new arrival with predatory assessment. The she-wolf had learned to distinguish between hunters and protectors, and something in these newcomers' purposeful movements told her they were here to help rather than harm. Abraham Stoneheart? The lead agent was a compact woman in her 40s with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much human cruelty. Agent Patricia Martinez, FBI. "Sheriff Morrison said we'd find you here with 2 endangered children." "Grace and Caleb Whitman," Abe confirmed, gesturing toward the little girl who still clutched her baby brother protectively. "Their mother Rebecca is in critical condition at Elkins General. Jackson here was about to add them to his collection of stolen children." Agent Martinez surveyed the scene with professional detachment. Jackson bleeding from Luna's bite, Dr. Chen cowering in the corner, evidence of the firefight scattered across the cabin floor. She'd spent 15 years investigating crimes against children, but Jackson Thornfield represented a special category of monster that made even hardened agents lose sleep. "Jackson Thornfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, human trafficking, racketeering, and about 40 other federal charges that'll keep you busy for the rest of your miserable life." Martinez's voice carried the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered her prey after years of pursuit. Jackson laughed bitterly as Agent Martinez cuffed his uninjured wrist to a tactical officer. "You think this ends anything? My buyers will find other suppliers within weeks. The demand never stops, Agent Martinez. Rich pedophiles will always pay premium prices for American children, and someone will always be willing to provide them." "Maybe," Martinez acknowledged grimly. "But thanks to your meticulous record-keeping, we've identified 67 buyers across 14 countries. Interpol is conducting raids as we speak, and several governments are very interested in discussing extradition treaties." The scope of Jackson's operation hit Grace like a physical blow. 67 monsters who bought children like toys, 14 countries where stolen American kids disappeared forever. She pressed her face against Caleb's soft hair and whispered the prayer their father had taught her. "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." Dr. Chen stepped forward hesitantly, her medical bag clutched like a shield against judgment. "Agent Martinez, I want to make a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for immunity. I have files on every child Jackson processed through my care, including current locations for 17 kids who are still recoverable." Martinez's expression didn't change, but Abe caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested personal investment. 17 children who are still alive. Alive and placed with buyers who haven't finished with them yet. Dr. Chen's voice cracked on the euphemism, her clinical detachment finally crumbling under the weight of her complicity. I kept detailed medical records, including DNA samples and dental impressions, enough to identify them even if their appearance has been altered. The revelation that 17 stolen children might still be rescued transformed the cabin's atmosphere from grim satisfaction to urgent purpose. Grace looked up from Caleb's sleeping form, her 7-year-old mind grappling with the concept that her nightmare might save other kids from similar fates. "Mr. Abe," she said quietly, "will you help find those other children too? Their mamas are probably crying every night, just like our mama did." Abe knelt beside her chair, his weathered face soft with something approaching peace. "That's exactly what we're going to do, sweetheart. Luna and I have been waiting 3 years for a chance to make things right. Now we've got 17 reasons to keep fighting." Agent Martinez coordinated the extraction with military precision. Jackson and Dr. Chen secured in separate helicopters, evidence carefully cataloged and transported. Grace and Caleb prepared for medical evaluation and eventual reunion with their mother. But as the chaos of law enforcement activity swirled around them, Abe found himself facing an unexpected choice. "Mr. Stoneheart," Martinez said, approaching him with a manila folder. "I've spoken with FBI Director Harrison about your situation. We'd like to offer you a position as consultant on our Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team. Your investigative work on Jackson's network was instrumental in breaking this case." The official vindication Abe had craved for 3 years felt hollow now, overshadowed by the knowledge that Sarah and Emma would never come home. But looking at Grace and Caleb, seeing their absolute trust in his ability to protect them, he understood that his purpose had evolved beyond personal vengeance into something larger and more meaningful. "What about Luna?" Abe asked, scratching behind the she-wolf's ears. "She's been my partner in this investigation longer than anyone." Martinez smiled, the first genuine expression Abe had seen from her. "The Bureau has used working dogs for decades. I don't see why we can't expand the program to include working wolves, especially one with Luna's proven track record." Luna seemed to understand the conversation's importance, her amber eyes moving between Abe and Martinez with intelligent assessment. The she-wolf had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, watching Abe piece together Jackson's network while learning to channel her protective instincts toward helping rather than hunting. Grace stood up carefully, still holding Caleb, and walked over to Luna. At 7 years old, she possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that adults often lost, and she could see the wolf's internal struggle between wild nature and chosen family. "Luna," Grace whispered, placing her small hand on the wolf's massive head. "You saved us. You saved Mr. Abe, too, didn't you? When he was all alone and sad, you came and made him remember how to help people." The simple truth of Grace's observation cut through Abe's emotional confusion like a blade through fog. Luna hadn't just been his companion during those dark years. She'd been his salvation, keeping him alive and functional when grief threatened to destroy him completely. As dawn broke over the Monongahela Mountains, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of gold and rose, Abe made his choice. He would accept Martinez's offer, but on his own terms. Grace and Caleb would need a stable home while Rebecca recovered, and 17 other children needed someone who understood the psychology of predators and the determination of loving families. "Agent Martinez," Abe said finally, "I'll take the job, but I work out of West Virginia. These mountains have been my home for 65 years, and they're where Luna and I do our best work." Martinez nodded approvingly. "The Bureau can be flexible when the results justify the arrangement." Your cabin would make an excellent base of operations for Appalachian region cases. The helicopter ride to Elkins General Hospital gave Grace her first aerial view of the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life, but ultimately delivered her salvation. From 1,000 feet up, the forest looked peaceful rather than threatening, its vastness suggesting infinite possibilities for those brave enough to venture beyond familiar boundaries. Rebecca Whitman was unconscious when they arrived at the hospital, her face pale against white pillows, machines monitoring vital signs that fluctuated between hope and despair. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the attending physician, explained that Rebecca's injuries were severe but not necessarily fatal. Traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding, 3 broken ribs, and psychological trauma that would require months of therapy. She's been asking for her children, Dr. Walsh said softly. Even in her unconscious state, she whispers their names. That kind of maternal bond often provides the motivation patients need to fight their way back to consciousness. Grace approached her mother's bedside with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space. Caleb stirred in her arms. His recovery from the asthma attack, nothing short of miraculous thanks to Dr. Chen's intervention and the mountain air's clarity. "Mama," Grace whispered, taking Rebecca's limp hand in her small fingers. "We're okay. Mr. Abe and Luna saved us, just like Daddy promised someone would." "The bad man can't hurt us anymore." Rebecca's eyelids fluttered at the sound of her daughter's voice, and for just a moment her fingers squeezed Grace's hand with enough strength to suggest that somewhere in the darkness of her injured mind she heard every word. Agent Martinez watched the reunion from the doorway, her professional composure wavering slightly. After 15 years of investigating crimes against children, she'd learned to maintain emotional distance as a survival mechanism. But something about Grace Whitman's fierce loyalty and Abe Stonehart's quiet determination reminded her why she'd chosen this particular form of law enforcement service. "How long before Rebecca can care for the children again?" Martinez asked Dr. Walsh privately. "If she makes a full recovery, and that's still a significant if, we're looking at 6 to 8 months of rehabilitation." Brain injuries are unpredictable, and the psychological trauma of nearly losing her children will require extensive therapy. Martinez nodded, already formulating plans. "The children will need foster care placement during their mother's recovery. I'll make sure they're placed with someone who understands their unique situation." "Actually," Abe interjected, having overheard the conversation, "I'd like to volunteer as their temporary guardian. Luna and I have plenty of room in the cabin, and those kids have been through enough disruption for one lifetime." The suggestion was irregular. A 65-year-old single man with no formal childcare experience seeking custody of traumatized children, but Martinez had seen enough bureaucratic failures in the foster care system to recognize when unconventional solutions might serve everyone's best interests. Grace looked up from her mother's bedside, her eyes bright with the first real hope she'd felt in months. "Mr. Abe, would you really let us stay with you and Luna, like a real family?" "Sweetheart," Abe replied, his voice thick with emotion he'd thought buried forever. "You and Caleb have already been part of our family since the moment Luna found you in that cabin. We're just making it official." 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through new windows in Abe's expanded cabin, illuminating a kitchen table set for 4 instead of the lonely place setting that had marked his years of isolation. Grace, now 8 years old and 3 inches taller, stood on a wooden stool helping Luna's 3 pups learn basic commands while Caleb toddled between them with the fearless confidence of a 2-year-old who'd never known anything but unconditional love. "Luna, watch," Grace commanded with the authority of someone who'd spent half a year learning wolf behavior from the best possible teacher. The she-wolf sat perfectly still as her pups, Hope, Faith, and Courage, attempted to mirror their mother's discipline with varying degrees of success. Hope had inherited Luna's intelligence, faith showed her mother's protective instincts, and courage possessed an adventurous spirit that kept everyone on constant alert. Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving slowly but steadily on her own 2 feet for the first time since the accident. The traumatic brain injury had stolen 6 months of her life, leaving gaps in her memory that might never fully heal, but the core of who she was, a mother who would sacrifice everything for her children, had survived intact. "Good morning, beautiful family," she said, her voice still carrying the slight slur that speech therapy was gradually correcting. The doctors had warned that full recovery might take years if it came at all. But Rebecca measured progress in moments like these, when her children's laughter filled a home that had known too much silence. Abe looked up from the morning coffee that had become a ritual shared rather than endured, his weathered face transformed by something he'd thought lost forever. Purpose beyond grief. The past 6 months had brought changes he never could have imagined. Grace and Caleb legally placed in his temporary custody, Rebecca living in the cabin's new addition while she recovered, Luna's pups transforming the quiet mountain retreat into something resembling controlled chaos. "Agent Martinez called this morning," Abe reported, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his command center for FBI consulting work. They found 3 more children from Jackson's network, 2 brothers in Romania and a little girl in Thailand, all alive, all coming home to their families. The news brought the total to 23 recovered children, each rescue adding another layer of meaning to the nightmare they'd all survived. Grace had insisted on learning about each child found, memorizing their names and ages like a prayer, understanding instinctively that their salvation was connected to her own. Jackson Thornfield had died in federal prison 2 months earlier, officially from complications related to his injuries, though the corrections officer's reports mentioned several suspicious incidents involving other inmates who'd learned about his crimes. His death had brought closure to some families while denying others the satisfaction of seeing him stand trial, but Grace had surprised everyone with her reaction. "I'm glad he can't hurt more kids," she'd told Abe with 8-year-old wisdom. "But I'm sad he never got to be sorry. Daddy always said being sorry was the first step to being better." Dr. Chen had proven more valuable alive than Jackson ever was dead. Her testimony and medical records had led to the dismantling of trafficking networks across 4 continents, and her cooperation agreement included provisions for working with recovered children's psychological rehabilitation. Redemption, Abe had learned, sometimes came in unexpected packages. The cabin itself had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated. What began as Abe's hermitage had become an unofficial safe house for other recovered children during their transition back to normal life. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team had established a regional office in the renovated barn, complete with communication equipment and case files that drew investigators from across the country. Luna padded over to Rebecca, her amber eyes reflecting the same protective intelligence that had first drawn her to Grace in that frozen cabin. The she-wolf had expanded her definition of pack to include this entire unlikely family, and her 3 pups were learning the same lessons about loyalty and love that transcended species boundaries. "Mama, watch this," Grace called out, holding up a crayon drawing that had become her preferred method of processing the events that had changed their lives. The picture showed 5 figures standing in front of a log cabin: a tall man with gray hair, a woman with kind eyes, a little girl holding a baby, and a large wolf surrounded by 3 smaller wolves. Above them all, a yellow sun smiled down from a cloudless sky. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Rebecca said, her heart swelling with gratitude for the family they'd found in their darkest hour. "What should we call it?" Grace considered the question with the seriousness of a young artist unveiling her masterpiece. "I think it should be called The People Who Stay, because Luna stayed when we were scared. Mr. Abe stayed when we needed help. You stayed even when you were hurt. And we all stayed together even when bad things happened. Abe felt something shift in his chest, the final piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 3 years. This was what Sarah would have wanted, what Emma would have chosen if she'd lived to see it. Not revenge against the monsters who'd destroyed their first family, but the creation of something new and beautiful from the ashes of loss. The people who stay, he repeated softly. I like that, Grace. That's exactly what families do. They stay. Through the kitchen window, the Monongahela Mountains stretched toward a horizon that no longer seemed like an ending, but a beginning. Somewhere out there, other families were being torn apart by predators like Jackson, but somewhere out there, other rescuers like Luna were leading lost children toward safety. The war against those who would steal innocence was far from over, but in this cabin, at this table, with these people, they had won something precious and permanent. They had stayed. Sometimes when life strips everything away, when we lose the people we thought we'd grow old with, when our purpose feels buried with our dreams, we discover that God hasn't abandoned us. He's simply preparing us for a different kind of family, one built not on blood but on choice. Grace Whitman learned at 7 years old that the bravest thing isn't avoiding the storm, but finding who stays beside you when the winds howl loudest. Abraham Stoneheart discovered at 65 that second chances don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they have 4 legs, amber eyes, and the wisdom to lead us toward children who need exactly what we have to give. For those of us who've buried spouses, raised children who've moved away, or wondered if our best years are behind us, this story reminds us that purpose doesn't retire when we do. Every day, somewhere in America, children need grandparent figures who understand that love multiplies rather than divides, that families grow strongest when they're chosen rather than assigned. Your experience, your patience, your hard-won wisdom, these aren't consolation prizes for getting older. They're exactly what someone, somewhere, desperately needs right now. What family memories do you treasure most from your own childhood, and how might those experiences help a child today? Have you ever found unexpected purpose or joy in an unlikely relationship that changed your perspective on what family really means? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.